At dawn in Johannesburg's O.R. Tambo International Airport, a gray-haired couple stood in disbelief before the departure board. Their Air France flight to Paris, already half-boarded, suddenly flashed red cancelled. In Lagos, passengers holding tickets to New York were told to disembark, and in Nairobi, two American cargo planes filled with electronics, rare earth minerals, and frozen produce sat stranded on the runway. What happened overnight? At precisely 2:13 a.m. Addis Ababa time, a sealed transmission raced across the continent. All U.S. and European aircraft, commercial or military, are banned from African skies until further notice. No press conference, no handshakes, just a quiet but thunderous decision. For decades, Africa's skies have been treated like open highways where foreign airlines and military cargo could pass without pause. But something shifted last night. The African Union, acting not as 54 separate nations, but as one voice, declared, "Our skies are not for free. Our sovereignty is no longer negotiable." Imagine the shock in Paris, Brussels, and Washington. Imagine the power of a single order that grounds fleets, halts shipments, and rattles global supply chains. This is more than a bureaucratic policy. It is a statement of independence written across the clouds. But here is the question we must all ask. Is Africa truly ready to hold this line? And what does this mean for nations like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, who has already redefined what sovereignty looks like on the ground? My friends, history is not written in textbooks first, it is written in the choices of the present. And today, Africa has chosen to reclaim not just its land and its gold, but its very skies. If you believe the world deserves to hear these stories, unfiltered, subscribe now. And if you feel Africa's skies belong first and foremost to Africans, please share this video because sovereignty is not a headline, it is a birthright. It began in silence. No televised speeches, no parade of officials. Just a coded signal sent from Addis Ababa at 2013 in the morning. By the time the African sun rose, the world's largest airlines had collided with a reality they had never imagined. Africa had shut its skies to America and Europe. At Johannesburg's O.R. Tambo International Airport, scenes of chaos spread like wildfire. Families heading to Paris for summer holidays stood stunned, watching as the departure board flashed, "Cancelled." A French businessman clutched his briefcase, shaking his head in disbelief. In Lagos, passengers on a KLM flight to New York were already seated when the pilot came on the intercom with trembling words, "We have lost clearance to depart. Everyone must disembark." Murmurs of confusion turned to frustration as entire plane loads of travelers were led back into the terminal. And in Nairobi, the crisis carried a deeper edge. Two U.S. cargo planes, their bellies loaded with rare earth minerals, electronics, and fresh produce destined for American supermarkets, sat frozen on the tarmac. Their engines had been switched off, their clearances revoked. One Kenyan worker described the scene as an air traffic earthquake, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. The official explanation from the African Union was brief security protocol upgrades. But those words were little more than a veil. Behind the curtain, insiders pointed to two mysterious flights that had slipped into African skies just days earlier, using newly integrated radar systems powered by Chinese Bado satellites and Russian GLONASS mapping the AU-tracked unidentified aircraft moving without permission. One flight darted across the Sahel dangerously close to AU military installations linked to the One Africa Army. Another hugged the Somali coastline, vanished into the Indian Ocean, and then reappeared over the Mediterranean. To African security analysts, these were not lost tourist planes. These were surveillance runs, suspected to be tied to NATO countries probing for weaknesses, eyeing Africa's gold reserves, its new Afrinet digital cables, even troop movements in East Africa. That was the trigger. And the response was unlike anything Africa had ever attempted before. For the first time in history, a unified African Air Command, the OAC, stepped forward. Headquartered in Addis Ababa, this body linked every radar station, every drone, every satellite feed on the continent into a single control network. No longer would Paris seek clearance from Dakar or Washington, whisper to Nairobi. From now on, if the skies were to open, the African Union itself would decide. By grounding U.S. and European planes, the AU wasn't just halting flights, it was tearing down an old assumption that Africa's airspace was a free corridor for foreign powers. Overnight, that assumption vanished. In the control room of the OAC, a young Ethiopian technician reportedly whispered to his colleague as the bans went into effect, "For the first time, we own our sky." It was a simple sentence, but its weight was enormous. Because this was not about a single country acting in protest. It was about an entire continent moving as one. The ban represented sovereignty not in speeches or promises, but in raw, enforceable power. And as passengers scrambled, as Western governments scrambled, Africa's message echoed clearly across the globe. The skies are not neutral. The skies are ours. As the sun climbed higher that morning, confusion turned into chaos. Airports across Africa became stages of disbelief. In Johannesburg, the terminal floor echoed with rolling suitcases and raised voices. At Lagos, the KLM pilot stood at the gate apologizing again and again to furious passengers clutching passports and tickets now useless. Families broke into tears while business travelers argued with staff who could only shrug and point at the notice, "No clearance from African Union." But the scene in Nairobi carried a weight no one could dismiss. The two grounded American cargo planes sat like stranded whales, their cargo holds filled with minerals critical to U.S. industry, rare earths, electronics, agricultural exports. Crews stood by helpless as AU air controllers repeated the same phrase, "permission denied." To many observers, this wasn't just an airline disruption. It was a blunt reminder that Africa could paralyze global trade with one order. Behind the decision stood not only politicians, but also some of Africa's most influential billionaires. Strive Masiyiwa, the Zimbabwean telecom tycoon; Ibrahim Traoré, Ghana's industrial magnate; Patrice Motsepe, South Africa's infrastructure investor. For years, they had lobbied the AU. Africa's skies are not only routes for passengers, they are the arteries of commerce, data, and defense. Whoever controls them controls leverage. Now their vision had found a home in the One Africa Air Command. The justification for such drastic action only grew stronger when new details leaked. Chairman Shadow, the mysterious insider, revealed that earlier in August, AU security intercepted a suspicious cargo shipment routed from Brussels to Accra. Declared as farm equipment, the containers instead concealed advanced interception gear, the very type used to spy on mobile networks. The EU let the shipment pass quietly, but filed it in a classified report. That report became one of the foundations for the unprecedented airspace ban. The climax of this unfolding drama arrived not in the terminals, but in the skies. At dawn, over Djibouti, fishermen looked up in awe as two Sukhoi fighter jets thundered above the Gulf of Aden, trailed by reconnaissance drones carrying the AU insignia. A second patrol streaked across Senegalese skies in West Africa, a clear message to NATO: "We see you. We will meet you." It was a cinematic moment, the kind that etches itself into memory. For generations, Africans had watched foreign fighter jets cross their skies with impunity. But on that morning, for the first time, it was African jets defending African skies. Reactions outside the continent were immediate. Western diplomats scrambled, warning of economic retaliation. Some predicted bans on African airlines entering U.S. and European airspace. But within Africa, the mood was different, tense, yes, but also electric. Radio stations in Ghana and Nigeria carried callers praising the AU's courage. A South African journalist tweeted today, "We learned sovereignty is not a speech. It is a scramblejet over your sky." The crisis had reached its high point. Ordinary travelers were stranded, billion-dollar cargo grounded, and international leaders stunned. Yet in that very turbulence, the African Union had staged its boldest declaration, yet a continent speaking with one voice, not begging for respect, but demanding it. For ordinary people, the impact was immediate. In airports from Johannesburg to Dakar, travelers sat slumped in chairs staring at their canceled tickets. Students heading abroad for studies missed their connections. Families waiting for loved ones were met with silence instead of arrivals. In Nairobi, a mother holding her toddler whispered into the phone, "We are stuck. The skies are closed." The civilian disruption was painful, but it was only the surface. Beneath it lay a shift with profound political weight. By acting as one, the African Union had taken a gamble, choosing sovereignty at the risk of short-term suffering. Ticket prices for regional carriers might drop if African airlines captured the market share once dominated by European giants. But cargo costs, at least in the short term, were likely to rise as logistics scrambled for alternatives. Governments faced pressure from their own citizens. Business owners complained of perishable goods rotting in grounded cargo holds. Exporters worried about contracts with partners in Europe. Yet, for many African leaders, the cost was worth the message: Africa will no longer be a free corridor for foreign powers. Politically, the ban carried two faces. On one side, it galvanized pride. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger nations already united in the Sahel alliance, people celebrated the AU's stand. Radio broadcasts hailed it as a turning point, proof that Africa could act as a single force. In Ouagadougou, a taxi driver told a reporter, "If they can take our gold and our oil without asking, why should they also own our skies?" On the other side, fears grew. What if the United States and Europe retaliated by banning African airlines from their skies? For Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways, and South African Airways companies that depend on international routes, such a move could mean devastating losses. Diplomats warned that the ban might spark a tit-for-tat trade war. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. For decades, Africa's skies had been governed by bilateral agreements often tilted in favor of Western powers. The AU's decision shattered that precedent. For the first time, approval didn't depend on Paris or London, it depended on Addis Ababa, the heart of the AU. The political implications extended further. In corridors of power across Africa, the question grew louder. Could this be the first real test of AU unity? Would all 54 nations stand firm if the ban dragged on, or would pressure fracture the resolve? For the people, it was a strange mixture of pride and uncertainty. Yes, their flights were canceled. Yes, businesses were hurting. But there was also a quiet satisfaction, a feeling that Africa was finally setting its own rules. One South African columnist wrote, "In a single night, Africa proved sovereignty is not a theory. It is a practice, and it comes with sacrifice." The civilian and political consequences were unfolding hour by hour. Yet one truth had become clear: this was not just an airline crisis. It was a moment that redefined the balance between Africa and the powers that had long claimed the sky above it. In Washington, the shock was palpable. Overnight cargo shipments of rare earth minerals critical to U.S. technology and defense industries had been frozen in Nairobi. Analysts on Capitol Hill warned that Africa's move could ripple into everything from smartphone production to military hardware supply chains. For decades, America had assumed that African skies were open highways. Now that assumption was gone, replaced with the unsettling realization that Africa could turn off the tap at will. In Brussels, European leaders gathered in emergency meetings. For the European Union, the crisis was twofold. Airlines like Air France, Lufthansa, and KLM were suddenly grounded, and critical goods from agricultural imports to telecommunications equipment were trapped mid-route. A senior EU diplomat admitted off-record, "This is not just an aviation problem. It is a sovereignty problem. Africa is changing the rules of engagement." Western media outlets, meanwhile, rushed to frame the ban as reckless. Headlines read, "Africa risks isolation and AU jeopardizes trade." Yet beneath the noise, a deeper unease lingered. If Africa could unify on airspace, what would stop it from unifying on oil, gold, or digital infrastructure? Other global players watched closely. In Beijing, commentators framed the move as proof of Africa's growing independence, supported by Chinese satellite technology. In Moscow, analysts highlighted the role of Russian GLONASS mapping in enabling AU radar systems. For both nations, the crisis underscored a strategic opening. Africa was no longer automatically aligned with the West. In the United Nations, debate turned heated. Some Western representatives called for sanctions if the ban continued, but African diplomats countered forcefully, insisting that their continent had the same right as any other to protect its skies. One AU ambassador asked bluntly, "If America can guard its borders and Europe can defend its airspace, why should Africa be denied the same?" For ordinary Americans and Europeans, the implications were subtle but real. Travelers, stranded businesses, delayed markets rattled. Yet for older generations, especially those who remember the Cold War, the deeper resonance was clear. Air corridors are not just about flights, they are about power. And for Africa, led by bold figures like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré, this moment was more than a ban. It was a declaration to the world: Africa is not a bystander. Africa is a player. As dusk fell across the continent, the skies above Africa were quieter than they had been in generations. No transatlantic flights slicing across the Sahara. No military cargo runs slipping past unnoticed. Only the steady hum of African patrol jets and the silence of a continent that had for the first time declared its airspace sacred. But with silence comes warning. For if the African Union holds this line, retaliation from the West is almost certain. U.S. and European governments may move to bar African airlines from their skies, punishing carriers like Ethiopian Airlines or Kenya Airways. Trade negotiations could sour. Aid packages could be withheld. The battle for sovereignty once waged over land and gold may now stretch into aviation finance and even cyberspace, and yet the symbolism cannot be ignored. In a single directive, Africa shifted the balance of power. What was once considered impossible, 54 nations acting as one voice has become a reality. The question is whether that unity can endure the pressure. For leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, this is not simply about planes. It is about a larger vision sovereignty that extends beyond borders and beyond speeches into the daily mechanics of global power. Controlling the skies means controlling the narrative, controlling the terms of engagement, and controlling the future. To the world, the message is clear. Africa is not a corridor to be crossed at will. It is a continent that demands respect. To Africans, especially the young, it is a reminder that sovereignty is costly, but dignity is priceless. And to you watching from afar, perhaps from the United States or Europe, the question is more personal. Do you think Africa can hold this line? Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of sovereignty will spread from land into the very skies, or will outside pressure force the continent back into submission? My friends, history does not wait. It is written in moments like this, moments when the weak are expected to bow, but instead they rise. If you feel that Africa taking back its skies is more than news, that it is history unfolding, please share this story. And if you believe the truth matters more than headlines, subscribe now. Because what happens over Africa's skies today may decide what happens on the ground tomorrow.